Everyone has a bright light inside of them that deserves to be seen by the world. That's why it's time to shine the light on the extraordinary who are accomplishing phenomenal things. This is the Shine Out Loud Show with Lillian Abo.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Shine Out Loud Show with me, Lillian Abogo. Oh, I am so excited tonight because we're talking about money and wealth building with a very incredible man, because this man is not just an academic. He's not just an economics expert, but he's also somebody that's very passionate about money and wealth building, that he's based his entire career around it. Now, I'm talking about Jonathan Thomas. Now, I know he's asked to be just referred to as Jonathan Thomas, but he's also a doctor because he's actually a PhD holder. And he is the director of Afronomica, a subscription-based economics and data analytic company that focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. And his experience is quite varied, from working in the city for a very long time for central government, investment banking, and fund management, as well as being a fellow of the Emmanuel College of Cambridge. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Jonathan Thomas to the show. Hi, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Lillian. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Great. I am so glad to get you on the show. And we've been actually working to get you on the show since I read one of your blog pieces. And we have the incredible Nicola Millington to thank for that.
Absolutely.
So, I've looked at your background, and we're talking money. We're talking not just about money, but we're talking about wealth building, everyday tips to build wealth in the community for us as individuals. And so it's good that when we look at your background, you've worked in the city, you've worked for central government, you've worked in various aspects. So what made you, first of all, step out of your own to create your own company?
It was a long-standing dream of mine, as a matter of fact, that I was kind of doing as a sideline, like a hustle, if you like, while I was working as an employee. And once I felt it was kind of viable, and I got the opportunity to devote all my energies towards Afronomica, that was what I did. So I'd been kind of blogging for about the previous kind of 4 or 5 years, building up my subscription pool, kind of generating interest, writing about things that were particularly kind of dear to me, which, as you've alluded to, was a focus on the economics of sub-Saharan Africa and the whole kind of development agenda. And it was a nice kind of diversion from my kind of day job, if you like. Plus, it's something that I'm passionate about. So once I got the opportunity, I think, to follow my heart rather than my head, this is where I've ended up.
Okay. So, and your work is mainly focused in sub-Saharan Africa. And, when we think about investing, we're not normally looking in that region. Is that an area that we as you say, the layperson should be looking at or can invest in?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd be quite surprised if anyone listening to the show that has a pension, even if it's a public pension, like a government sort of pension, doesn't have some exposure, whether they know it or they don't, to the economies of sub-Saharan Africa in terms of what that pension will be worth when they eventually do kind of retire and are able to just to cash it in. So we already do have some exposure. Most of the fund managers that our pension providers will give our money to in order to manage on our behalves will almost kind of certainly have some exposure to some of the economies, the equity markets, the bond markets, and indeed the currency markets of sub-Saharan Africa. So the vast majority of us are already in, if you like. It's just that we don't know it. But in addition to that, I think there also is a case for being more explicit about kind of diverting some of our resources and our savings, if we are interested in wealth building for the long term, towards those markets, because some of the returns are really they're kind of juicy, and the risk is not as great as you may believe, as a matter of fact.
Okay, now you've actually pointed on something, which is the risk. And I think that that's the first thing, because when we think of investing our money, we think, there are a few things that we mentally kind of put together, that it has to be a stable environment politically. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there are places that are not so stable, that people go, well, wouldn't that make a difference when I'm investing money? And especially if we were to believe CNN, BBC, and all the mainstream media, that this area is unstable and unstable, that so we might be reluctant to want to engage that way.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd like to think that our audience would be more inclined, I think, to broaden their sources of information about what's actually happening on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa, beyond the media outlets that you sort of mentioned. There are a whole host of issues with the PR as far as the economies of sub-Saharan Africa that sort of goes. Things are much more kind of stable and agreeable than you might be led to believe. And let's not be confused by the fact that we don't have instability, a political instability and economic instability in the more developed world, if you like, such as the UK, the US and the Eurozone, that doesn't feed through to our savings and our pensions are kind of right here. The volatility of the FTSE kind of 100, if you like, which which all of our listeners will be kind of familiar with, is at its core and fundamentally kind of no different to investing in the Johannesburg kind of stock exchange or the Nigerian or the main equities of Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, sort of Namibia. So all these markets do involve some risk. If you're not interested in the trade-off between risk and reward, then really, certainly up to your first beyond your first £85,000, which you can put in a UK bank and you're guaranteed to get it back by the government, even if the bank were to go bust, then you really ought to just put it under your mattress.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that we have to be prepared to take a level of risk and look outside of what we know, because there is a benefit that we can get a good return on our investment.
Absolutely. And I would also sort of venture, I think it's really important that the risk isn't necessarily larger than the risk that you'd see in the UK or the US or the Eurozone or Australia or any of the other kind of developed sort of equity or bond markets out there. That's not to say that the risk is zero, but it's not excessive by any means. For example, just to give you an example, despite the press it gets, the Nigerian kind of stock market has outperformed both the FTSE 100 and the S&P kind of 500 and all the main developed sort of European markets such as the DAX and the CAC since the start of the year. More recently, the main kind of Ghanaian index has outperformed these markets as well over the last sort of 3 months. I think it's really quite interesting that despite lots of reports about a political risk in Kenya with the upcoming election on August the 8th, and there's been a plethora of concern within the media about the risk that may entail. The Kenyan stock market is booming, as is, and I think this is really important, the market that we're probably all kind of most exposed to, which is the South African key market, the key equity market in South Africa. In fact, that touched an all-time high earlier today. So I think it's important to do your research, have some idea about the level of risk that you're able to tolerate. Think about what the worst outcome for you could possibly be if everything did go sort of pear-shaped, and act accordingly. But let's not get away from the fact that that's exactly what you should do if you were to take out an ISA in the UK as well. I mean, you do the same kind of mental exercise. It's no kind of different. You adjust your allocation according to the risk that you're prepared to kind of take on.
Okay. Now, Jonathan, I'm going to have to go back to a couple of things that you've just said because actually sitting here, I'm going, I didn't know that, and I didn't know that. The fact that the Nigerian market has actually outperformed the UK and the US consistently over across the year, you'll never hear that. And since the start of the year. So that's actually quite impressive. And it's something that we don't know, we don't hear of. And this is a conversation that I want to start having more of because it's we know will act accordingly. So we're talking about this, and we're not just talking about the markets and how to follow them, because some of us don't know how to follow that. Some of us are unsure. So my first question that we had tweeted into you is, how does one follow all these markets, and how do you follow all these markets to understand the information that is coming through?
Okay, well, there are various kind of websites that beyond the sort of newspapers such as the FT or the Wall Street, a kind of journal which you can have access to for a subscription at a price. There are various kind of websites that you can look at. I think the easiest one to look at is one called sort of tradingeconomics.com, which and that's it's this trading in just a traditional kind of spelling and economics, traditional kind of spelling.com, and that basically has a rundown of all the key equity markets globally, all of the commodity markets and the currency markets as well, and some of the bond markets as well. So, and that will give you a rundown of the returns in each of these sort of markets over the day, over the week, over the month, and over the year. So that's an easy way, I think, just to do a cross-check as to how the sub-Saharan African sort of markets and North African markets as well. Let me not exclude Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia, which are the main ones in the north of the continent. And you can get a straightforward kind of comparison sort of that way. Now, in terms of trying to get exposure to these sort of markets and trying to buy into them, there are various what's known as exchange kind of traded funds, which is basically you can think of it as a vehicle that replicates the behavior of, say, the key sort of Nigerian sort of stock market index, or the South African one, or you can even get one that follows the Egyptian a kind of market, and it tends to track it. So when these key markets rise or fall, so will the value of your investment if you hold what's known as an exchange traded sort of fund. So you can think of it as a tracker, like a fund, and you can buy these things for the S&P sort of 500 and for the FTSE 100 as well. They're very sort of liquid, they're very accessible, and they really are, I think, an easy way of getting into these markets and just trying to make some money from them.
Well, that sounds very interesting. And actually, once I get off here, I'm going to sign up to some of those subscription sites myself and start taking a look, because it's our responsibility to actually know what's out there. Now, tonight we're talking about wealth building, and we're looking specifically internally at our community. So let's start with this. And we always talk about wealth and riches and, being rich and being wealthy. In your estimation, from your perspective, what's the difference between being rich and being wealthy?
Well, I think the difference that I think of in terms of being sort of wealthy is being wealthy is intergenerational. And I think that's quite an important distinction for our community. And an example that really kind of resonates with me is if we think of our family businesses that our uncle, our aunt, or even ourselves may have kind of started, or our parents, etc. How many of those businesses are viable if the person that starts the company were to pass away, were to pass on? And I think that's the acid test of wealth. Is it something that's actually intergenerational? Is it something that your children or your spouse or your loved ones would be able to inherit? So real wealth is sort of intergenerational. uh, being rich is current, and being rich is for the moment, and typically being rich means that you could be poor fairly quickly. Intergenerational sort of wealth, or being a kind of wealthy, is far more kind of durable, and stable. So I don't think there's a figure. There is no figure. It's going to differ for each individual. But the assets that you hold, if you are wealthy, will be intergenerational. Here's an example. If I've got a house and I've paid for it, that's an asset that I can dispose of as I choose to in my will, or if I want to sell it at any point, and I'll have a tangible sort of return for it. If I've got a pair of the latest kind of gadget, or the latest a kind of car, if I've got and this is a pair of sneakers, they're going into an Americanism there. If I've got a pair of trainers very expensive, or I've got the latest kind of gadget, or I have a car, well, that is and it's not kind of paid for. Visually, I'd be rich in terms of I've got an asset that has some sort of value. But it's far harder for me to transfer that asset into the future. And it's far harder for me to use it as collateral in order to raise even more income. So wealth is intergenerational, and it can deliver a collateral sort of for you. Being rich need not be able to do either of those things.
Okay, so I like that, and I like this conversation around intergenerational, because you laid out something very important. Do we have businesses or things that actually can go intergenerational? And when we're looking at it, it sounds like a big concept, but think about the Hiltons. That's intergenerational money, because she's trading off the Hilton family, the Hilton name, the money that her great grandfather created or grandfather created. So I think we need to start looking more at what are we putting down that has a legacy. Where is our legacy going to lie? And and what are we putting forward? And I think that, so with that question comes another one, which is one of the things that I still find is that we're afraid to discuss money or even how to build wealth. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think it's a legacy of history. I think on a personal level, so I don't want to generalize. I'm only going to speak about what I've seen and what I've experienced with members of my family and my friends. There can be a lack of trust, a lack of a kind of confidence in each other, and I perfectly understand where that kind of comes from. Especially in the diaspora, and given our historical experiences, there's also a feeling of, I think even if we are, to coin the phrase, kind of rich, that tends to be so tenuous in that it's linked to our salary at the moment, that there is a feeling that it could kind of disappear fairly kind of quickly. So there's a lack of a kind of confidence in our richness, if you like, which makes us relatively kind of reticent, I think, to speak to each other about it, both inside and outside of kind of the family. And I must admit, that's one thing that I think I've struggled with and grappled with, just to be more open, because I think being open, it forces you to think about the future. And it forces you to think about whether or not, the way how you're allocating any income that you may have at the moment between kind of spending, kind of saving, and creating the sort of wealth is optimal. Is it what you really want to do, or are you just not thinking about it? And I think there is a case for us to be more sort of open. It doesn't mean you've got to expose all of your business to all and sundry. But certainly within the family, I think that's very important. And I think it's also important because if we're going to break the cycle, then our children in particular need to know the difference between being wealthy and being rich. They need to know that however we do it, many of us are trying to preserve some wealth for them in the future. And we expect that it's their duty to do the same as many of our parents did for us. So I think it's a real opportunity at the moment just to break the cycle and to change the game.
I agree. And I think, if we start with our family and start taking that outside little by little, so outside of our circle, so, from our family to our friends, and start creating this almost like an alcove of those conversations that we start having and start teaching, and it might, in this generation, improve.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I suspect it's a key piece of the jigsaw if we are going to sort of generate this sort of wealth and create wealth, and for that wealth to be enduring. And when I say sort of wealth, it doesn't have to be, hundreds of thousands of pounds, millions of pounds, or even kind of thousands of pounds, right? I'll give you a quick example. When our oldest kids were born, we signed up with one of the main kind of fund managers in the UK. They had a savings scheme for sort of children, which was £50 a month. And we kind of subscribed for both our eldest kind of children. We've probably put into that fund the equivalent of about kind of £10,000, but the fund is worth kind of double that at the moment, and we'll use that to contribute to their sort of university fees. So that I see, as a fairly a kind of painless kind of wealth creation for us and our sort of children. And really, we did it without having to think about it. Now, that's not the only way how you can sort of generate some wealth. You can invest in physical assets. You can go straight into equities, if you like, kind of yourself or any of the markets, or you can set up a partner, as we call it in the Caribbean, with your friends and use that to generate the sort of wealth. So there are various kind of routes, but I actually think that every family ought to at least consider that. And if that's not the way that you want to go, that's cool. But I think you ought to give yourself an opportunity, and we ought to give ourselves an opportunity as a community in the UK and beyond.
Oh, Jonathan, you've just touched on something that is actually quite dear to me. That partner term for Nigerians in the Igbo community, they call it Isuzu. I'm not sure what the Yorubas call it, but it's done, but it's not done to great effectiveness sometimes, because right now I've seen where it's now called peer-to-peer savings in the city. Absolutely. And is generating billions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Lillian, I think the key point about this is that certainly when our parents first came to the UK, and I suspect when they emigrated elsewhere to the US and to Canada as well, that was the key sort of mechanism by which we would kind of come together. We'd each contribute however much it was into the pot each month, and then each month somebody would get the pot, and that often was used as a deposit in order to purchase a house or to purchase a flat or to purchase another asset, which really gave our parents, a kind of generation, a foothold in the UK, and actually was their key kind of source of wealth. And if each of our parents had tried to do it alone, they would never have advanced as quickly as they did, or had some of the assets that they ended up acquiring, particularly in the form of a kind of housing. And I think that's a lesson I think that we often kind of forget, that it was by, it was true. It was through kind of trusting each other, kind of believing each other, having faith and pooling our resources, that in fact, a group of a kind of 20 sort of couples, each of them at the end of a kind of 2 years could have acquired a deposit in order to purchase a house. I mean, that's an incredible kind of power of compounding. And I think it demonstrates the power of thinking outside the box, thinking inside the family, of course, but also extending outside and leveraging our income that we have in order to generate some wealth.
Yeah, and I think we need to, like you said, we need to go back to that lesson. We need to go back to those lessons of saying this is how it was done and start doing it again. Because if we don't do it, who's going to do it? The fact that it's now being done by the city boys and being used the fancy title of being peer-to-peer lending and peer-to-peer savings, and then it's now something that will be exclusive to a certain strata, and we'll think it's something that, again, is not for us, whereas it was something that was started by us within our community.
Absolutely. It's just a relabeling of something that we've done historically for kind of generations. I mean, I think its motivation is slightly kind of different in what's known as peer-to-peer sort of lending at the moment. But it is quite important, because I think that one of the complaints that you often hear from people in our community who are thinking of starting businesses or expanding, and the scale of our businesses is absolutely kind of critical to our advancement. Maybe we can come on onto that kind of later. Is that we find it sort of difficult to get the loans and access to sort of capital that other kind of communities seem to get from the formal kind of banking sort of sector. And we see that in the UK, in the US, even in the Caribbean. I can't speak for sub-Saharan Africa, Africa in general, in particular. I've not had those kind of conversations with sort of business, but I do know that it's true in the three places that I've mentioned. And in France, actually, I've had some experience of speaking to people there. Well, other communities that face the same kind of barriers, and we're not alone in that. We don't necessarily tick all the boxes that some lenders in the more kind of formal sector are interested in, but other communities are able to self-fund in exactly the same way that we use the partner or the SUSA system or the rotating sort of credit association system to do, and bypass the formal kind of banking sector completely, and expand and still kind of make our mark in terms of generating businesses and employment and profits and returns and wealth even for our sort of community. So it can be done. It really just needs just the will and the lead.
And and again, so the question is, who will take the lead? Sometimes I feel like it's a question of people are looking out going, well, I don't want to be the first one to do it because I don't want to stick my neck out. What if it goes wrong? But my question is always, what if it goes right?
Absolutely. I mean, we have our own sort of partner group within my family and about sort of 10 other kind of families that's been running for years. And it's got to be based on trust.
Yes.
The normal way how these things go, listen, if I've got a friend and I trust my friend and my friend kind of recommends you to me, I'm taking it implicitly that my friend has done the legwork, they have a relationship with you, they know the kind of person that you are, they understand your capability and your kind of willingness in order to contribute kind of fully. And we're sort of kind of good to go. Other communities, it's done through their kind of religious organizations. Some of our churches, in fact, are engaged in those activities, both to fundraise for the church, but for members of the congregation. I mean, I think it really is. I mean, the thing is, just to start small, think about the people that you trust, kind of broach the issue. All of us are facing the same kind of issues, kind of barriers and complications in our lives. And this is one way of getting over.
I agree, and I think people should actually look out. There are people now that I have started running the rotational system, the partner system, as an online situation. I think there's a young lady in London that's doing it. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but I will find it and place it on the website because she's doing it right now. And I think this is and the reason why we're still stuck in this, because it is a good way to start somewhere and start building, and you can use it to build quite quickly. Because I have a direct example. My hairdresser who I go to has her own salon, and she did it through the system. And when she told me this, I was like, wow, I was really, really proud of her, because she understood the gap in the market. She understood that there's a problem, where she could go and look at the formal institutions for lending money. She may not get get the money that she requires, but she found a way around it. So I think it's looking at what we have in terms of around us to actually start up and move forward.
Absolutely. Another example that I've very recently kind of come across was a group of friends who decided that they wanted to get into property sort of development, both buying, developing and selling. They effectively kind of crowdfunded the fund that they wanted to raise in order to buy a property and develop it. In the end, there were about kind of 40 of people kind of got on board with not a kind of huge amount each. And I think that's critical to say that this does not actually have to involve hundreds of pounds a month by any means whatsoever, or beyond that. It could be kind of very small. They've managed to buy a property, they've developed it, they've sold it, and they've decided that they're going to try to reinvest the profits that they made into some other sort of properties and take it sort of from there. So, I mean, this is something that you can start small and you can grow and you can really sort of develop. And I think the example of your kind of hairdresser is one that really kind of warms my heart, because I love it when we actually fund and support, help to fund and support our own sort of businesses. That's one of the key avenues by which we're going to make sort of progress across the diaspora and in Africa itself, is by kind of supporting each other. Other communities will support us, but only in very kind of narrow and specific kind of cases and areas. If we're really going to break out and scale up our businesses in particular, and I think that's absolutely kind of critical that we acquire some scale, then it's going to involve a kind of community sort of crowdfunding, in fact.
And I keep saying this, how can we expect any other community to support our businesses if we're not willing to support our own? It's insanity, because look at the Indian community. They have a way of supporting businesses. Now, there's a corner shop not too far from my home, and it's an Indian-owned newspaper corner shop. Now, since I've lived in that area, it's changed hands, I think, about 6 times. And the last, the second to the last people who own it now, they had a son who was my age and, was uni, and kind of explained how it worked. And I sat there and had him, and he explained to me the process of, what happens when they come over, or their parents come over. They start to work in the shop supporting the other family in the shop, and then they get money put in, and then it's sold to them, and then they support somebody else, and it's sold on once they've gotten their investment back from it, and it never leaves their hands. The son was being put through a very good red brick university, studying psychology and a few other things, and he didn't have to worry that most of us will have, and the challenges, because he was being set up. And so we can walk by and go, it's just a corner shop, but that corner shop is actually building something amazing, because the next set of doctors, lawyers are going to come out of that.
Absolutely, and that's a key way of building a sort of wealth, and that is something that is actually intergenerational, right? It passes both across the community, but it stays inside, but it also passes from parent to child and to grandchildren and beyond. I mean, as you might say in the States, that's real juice.
It is, and I think we need to start looking at those pictures. Now, we're talking about wealth, and then there's this whole thing that if you've left it too late, it's, basically it's curtains for you, there's no more opportunities. But is it possible to start late and still build wealth? Absolutely.
It's never too late. It really kind of isn't. Of course, the later you start, there will be a lower kind of ceiling on the returns that you could kind of possibly make compared to if you started kind of 20 years ago. But let's take a simple example. If you opened an ISA kind of today, you've got an upper limit on ISAs of about a kind of 20k. And now you don't have to you don't have to pump a kind of 20k into an ISA by any means, but the returns that you get are absolutely kind of tax free. So that's almost a kind of brainer. You could hold an ISA for a year, all right, and you will get a return depending on which ISA you pick and how it performs. But you could get kind of 3%, 4%, kind of 5%. Above inflation, if you like. That's real kind of cash that's going into your sort of pocket. Who would look at something like that and say, no, it's too late for me to become involved? And the key thing about this, and what I always say to a lot of my kind of friends and colleagues, is that if you put your money in the bank at the moment with the bank rate at 0.25%, that's about what you'll be earning a year on a deposit account. Excuse me, on a standard kind of deposit account, certainly something less than kind of 1% a year. So why would you keep the same amount of money in a deposit account or a savings account that's not sort of working for you, when you could, with no risk whatsoever, because your principal or the amount that you put into an ISA, if it's done through a bank, is guaranteed, so there's a kind of no risk, you're going to get an above inflation kind of return. I mean, it's I think it's a simple equation.
Well, I think that there is more conversation around this whole starting late and still building wealth, but there's also questions around ISAs and what we don't know, because there's a lot of things. If you look at ISAs now, some of them are not performing that great. People are kind of worried. There's still that we don't trust the banks, but we need to start getting past our stuff and say, well, our money has to go somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, providing the institution that you place your money with is kind of regulated and is kind of monitored, and the fund managers have a track record, and they've kind of demonstrated their ability to pick whatever asset class or asset sort of classes that they're going to invest in and do well, then I think it's well worth the risk. Now, not everybody is going to make kind of money when they invest. I mean, that's, it's not quite a zero-sum game, but often it is. There are winners and there are losers, depending on what side of the market that you're on, depending on what asset that you're trying to buy or sell. But I think if you act kind of judiciously, and also the golden rule is don't commit any money that you're not prepared to lose, then that's fine. I think of it, if we're brutally honest, right, and many of us will take a flutter on the horses at certain times of the year, whether it's the Grand National or the Derby, and we'll bet a certain amount in the full kind of knowledge that there's a chance that we'll lose it. That's why we don't bet our mortgage on it. On a particular horse or something. Well, I think equity markets, the housing market, kind of bond markets, or just kind of general kind of savings products, I know they're sort of different. Don't bet more than you're prepared to lose. Keep an eye on the race, depending on how long you plan to invest your money for. And if things look as if they're not going so well, in 90% of cases, you can pull your money out at an instant. Sometimes that will be a good decision. Sometimes that will be a bad decision, because just as quickly as markets can fall, they can rise again. And sometimes, it's best to enter a market just after it's falling, because there's only one way that it can go, which is up. So, I don't think that that's an excuse for not kind of being involved. And you don't have to, you don't necessarily have to be an expert in any of these markets or sectors at all. As I said, there are tracker funds where you can literally invest in the FTSE 100, and then every day you can check how the FTSE 100 is done, and you can find out over the course of a month, a quarter, or a year or so how your investment is done. It's really fairly kind of easy. The good thing is that, on average, stock markets do rise. Okay, there will be periods of stress, such as we saw during the sort of recession,
Yes.
the 2008 to 2009 kind of recession, where things will look kind of really bad. But if you bought right at the bottom of that sort of period, you'd have more than kind of doubled your money sort of now. In fact, you'd probably kind of tripled your money easily in almost any of the key markets out there. So there's money to be made. Other communities are making it. We can make it too. Just don't be excessive in how much you're prepared to shell out. I think that's the key thing. Don't bet what you can't lose, what you're not prepared to lose.
And I think on that note, that's a good place to segue because, I have loads more questions, and there's a couple of key points that you pulled out there about not betting more than you're willing to lose. But I think for me, the key point is that people make money during times of instability. People make money during times of Great Depressions. We've seen that happen.
Absolutely.
So if you were just joining us, I am talking to Jonathan Thomas, and we're talking about everyday tips to generate wealth. And we're not talking being rich, we're talking about intergenerational wealth, creating things that outlive you and become a legacy piece. This is about how can we start looking at our money as a vehicle that will work for us as a community as a whole. And we've covered stuff around understanding what you can do to build money together, because you can't go far on your own. You go further with someone else. Looking at the old systems that our ancestors came up with, the partner system, which is now being known as the rotational savings systems. If you're Nigerian and from the Igbo community, it's called the Isuzu system, as being one of the ways that we can start looking at almost crowdfunding our next dream, our next big venture. So, and we're still talking. I think one of the other questions is, what can we start doing? I mean, we've covered quite a few, but what can we do tomorrow to start creating a family wealth plan?
Okay. Well, I think the thing, I always think that you've got to kind of start from your sort of destination and work kind of backwards. So the first thing that I would say, and almost every a financial advisor would kind of say this, is that even before you think of starting to generate sort of wealth or think of increasing your savings or where to allocate it, think about your debts first and really think about those debts that are sucking kind of cash out of you every month and not giving you much of a return. And mainly that means kind of credit cards and store cards. I mean, the interest rates on those things are absolutely horrendous, and we've all had to use them at times, but it makes far more sense, I think, to clear the debt or to clear as much debt as you possibly can on credit cards and loans, a car loan, for example, before you even think of increasing your allocation to a kind of savings, because there's no point that you're saving £50 a month, which is generating you 5% a year, when if you had to put that same £50 a month towards your kind of credit card, it could eventually kind of save you £500 a year. So I think it's a no-brainer. So I think you really do have to do the calculation about does it make sense, and often it will make sense. The first thing is just to try to reduce your debts, and credit cards in particular, and car loans, etc., as much as possible, because I think the savings that you make from that are much kind of greater than the returns that you could possibly make if you were to put that same amount of money immediately into any kind of fund managed kind of product, sort of generally. Let's just take a simple example. Let's suppose that when we get a credit card, a kind of bill, it will normally say that there's a minimum kind of payment that that the bank wants you to make, and normally we will pay that minimum sort of payment. You may be surprised to know that in some cases, half of that kind of minimum sort of payment is interest. Okay. You're not really making a big dent in the principal, in the amount that you kind of borrowed in the first place.
Right.
You're paying off the interest. And every month that you just pay that kind of minimum amount, and we've all kind of done that, your actual eventual interest payment, or the total that you end up sort of paying, is increasing, and sometimes it's increasing at a faster rate. So really, all you're doing is throwing away sort of money, or giving your creditor some free kind of money. I want to try to cut that debt as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and save yourself some pounds that you can invest kind of later. So I always think that's the first place to kind of start. How much am I laying out on interest, and what can I do in order to cut that down? And then I think you think about, right, where do I want to be over some kind of time horizon, be it the next year, the next kind of 3 years, the next kind of 5 years, or the next kind of 20 years, and what's the best route for me to get there, given my tolerance of risk. And we've all got different kind of tolerances of risk. If you and I were to be placed in the same car, on the same kind of road, would probably kind of drive kind of differently, depending on how fast you wanted to go, and our tolerance for the danger that comes with increased sort of speed. So I think you've got to make the same kind of analysis when it comes to thinking to yourself, what's the best way of me being able to acquire wealth? As we've alluded to kind of before, an ISA is a fantastic place to start, because it's relatively cheap. You can control the amounts that you put away each month, and the return is guaranteed. The return is mostly guaranteed, not in every single case, but I think if you do your homework and stick to the more kind of popular funds, and certainly the funds that are offered by your bank, by any of the main kind of high street sort of banks, then you won't go sort of far wrong. And then as you get sort of more kind of comfortable, and you begin to track these things, I think, a little more, then you can start thinking of other kind of savings sort of mechanisms, which can also include, paying down on your mortgage, of course. That is one of the most kind of tax efficient kind of savings mechanisms that you can kind of possibly kind of have, especially at a time when house prices are rising fairly sort of quickly. So I think that those are the three kind of things that I would think are the first thing. Think about how much you're laying out on interest. Think about where you want to be over the time horizon that you want to be. Think about an ISA. And the fourth one is also, of course, to think about paying down on your mortgage, which is an efficient way of saving out on any outlays that you may have to make in the long run.
Okay, so you've these 4 tips are actually very, very essential, and I think, please, people, do not, as they say, do not sleep on this. Do your financial housework. Look at where your money is going each month. Look at where your outlays are, and look at how to reduce that. Now, you've touched on debt, and you touched on credit cards. Can debt and credit be a good thing? Can you ever have good debt? And can credit card actually help your wealth building process?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've actually engaged in it in the past. When there were kind of 0% sort of credit card deals out there were a lot of them before the 2008 to 2009 kind of recession, and they're beginning to come back. Funnily enough, I've seen a few on the market where you could borrow an amount at 0% and people actually kind of borrowed that debt and used it to invest in housing. They used it to put down a deposit on a small flat or a small ICA house, and immediately they got a toe into something that could generate some wealth for them over their kind of lifetime at a 0% sort of rate of interest. That's well worth kind of considering almost under any sort of circumstances. So the whole point about kind of credit and debt, and that's quite important for our community, because I certainly know that there are members of our community who take a dim view of debt and kind of credit, especially on a short-term kind of basis in terms of loans and kind of sort of credit cards, as somehow, as somehow acquiring excessive kind of risk. But it all depends on what you do It all depends on what assets you use the credit for. If you're smart, you can use that credit to actually increase your wealth over the long run. And we know what that means. If you go to the bank and you say, I want to borrow £30,000 in order to buy, let's say, a particular car, say, which is a depreciating asset, let's not forget, the bank will probably be quite keen on lending you that money if it thinks you're kind of credit-worthy. But at the end of the day, that's not going to be a route to acquiring wealth. If you took that same kind of 30K and you invested it in a business, or you invested it on buying some kind of property, or something that's going to give you a return kind of month on month, and that's a far more efficient use of your borrowing sort of capacity. So I'm cool with debt. Everybody knows how much debt they're kind of comfortable with. Do the sums on the payments you're going to have to make every month or every year on the debt that you just sort of borrow. Make sure that, I always say, as a rule of thumb, make sure that if you were to lose your job or your business or the revenues that your business were going to sort of generate were to be sort of cut in half or cut by kind of 75%, have I got kind of 3 months worth of kind of savings I can keep it kind of going? Normally, within that time, we're able to refinance or to find a new job or to make the adjustments in our kind of spending that we can kind of bounce back. So if you make sure that you can actually kind of do that, and that you're not sort of borrowing above a level that will make you feel kind of comfortable at being able to rebound were the worst to sort of kind of happen in terms of your job or your income stream, then I would say kind of go for it. Everyone's got a different kind of tolerance of debt and a tolerance of risk, and we all will know when we feel uncomfortable with the level of debt or risk that we're kind of taking on. But the key thing is making sure that most of the debt that you kind of take on, you're able to finance, and that you're using it for something kind of productive. There's a reason why the biggest debt that most people have is their house, is to pay their mortgage, because on average over our lifetimes, house price, the gain that we get in house prices will by far outweigh the cost of the mortgage that we end up having to pay, and that makes sense, and that's what banks are relying on. So unless your timing is really bad and you're forced to sell in the middle of a housing market kind of slump, which does occur, then you'll be way ahead of the game, and that's kind of good debt.
Okay, so good debt, we need to have some good debt to further our wealth building abilities. Now, I have just had this question come in, and somebody goes, I don't like the markets because of the risk, and I'm not really into real estate. For wealth building, what other options can I look at?
Oh, well, there's a whole host of options. There's a whole host of investable assets out there. I'm going to be slightly kind of tongue-in-cheek here. You can invest in wine if you like. You know, people do that all the time. There's quite a thriving kind of wine market. I'm just giving you that as an example, right, where people actually say, okay, do you know what? I'm going to go to a wholesaler. I'm going to do a little bit of kind of research. I'm going to find out what's a kind of popular kind of wine that's going to hold its value, and even be even more kind of valuable in 10 years' time. We always hear these kind of periodic sort of stories of wines that are worth much more in 10 years' time than they were at the time when the actual wine was made and put into bottles. And you can buy some cases of that and store it in your cellar, providing that the temperature's right, and you can make some money. Some people, I have a friend who's very big in kind of vintage cars, and when I say the kind of vintage cars, I mean cars from the 1950s and sort of 60s. He takes them, he fixes them up. He's a mechanic, so that helps. He fixes them up, and then he resells them. That's absolutely fine. So those are two examples of some asset classes that you might not actually kind of think of as viable, investable kind of assets that you can make some that you can make, a decent kind of return on, and that also, providing you know what you're doing and you take the advice and you do your research across the experts, are relatively kind of low risk. Let's get even kind of more street, if you like. People are investing in sneakers, right? We mentioned kind of them before.
Yeah.
People are invested in trainers. If you had the first pair of Air Jordans, box fresh, okay, from the 1980s, I can almost kind of guarantee you that you'd kind of get a multiple back on your money sort of many times over.
Wow.
So you don't have to, go down the stock market or the property market or the bond market route by any sort of means at all. I think that if you are kind of serious about building wealth, then you would need to think about kind of diversifying the asset class that you're invested in. So, for example, you'll find a kind of very few fund managers or financial advisors will say to you, put all of your money in equities. I guarantee you that's going to work. That would be some pretty unsound advice, because no one can predict the future. But the great thing about lots of markets is that they're relatively correlated, which means that when one market goes down, another market will be sort of rising. And a lot of fund managers kind of use that in order to spread the risk and to reduce the chance that they're going to lose money overall. So there's many ways to do it. And if you're talking to a fund manager sounds particularly exotic. It's a financial advisor. You can kind of, they're kind of 10 a penny, even on the high street. They work with and for accountants, for example. Okay. Ask them about, what assets that they would kind of recommend, how correlated they are, what their track record is. How do they see the market kind of playing out over the timescale with which you're interested in? Really kind of prod and probe them. Take the time out to make them work for the commission that they're going to be sort of charging you.
Okay, so yeah, I like this idea. Jonathan, I'm going to get you back because we're going to talk about these asset classes that we can invest in that are outside the norm, because as of today, I didn't know you could invest in sneakers was a commodity, so to speak, in that respect. Now, before we wrap this up, we need our So Loud moment of the week from you.
Wow. Yeah. I guess the moment that's resonating with me the most at the moment, in fact, is to do with sort of equity markets, and it's to do with the Ghanaian, with the key sort of Ghanaian equity sort of market, which I've got a little bit of exposure to, and it's up kind of 25% on the year. Now, let me be explicit about that. That doesn't mean that if I had £1 invested in the Ghanaian stock market at the start, like a year ago, I'm going to get £1 at kind of 25 now, because it's valued in Ghanaian kind of cedis and SOCDs, and because the CD has depreciated a little bit against the pound over that sort of period, I won't get kind of 25% back. But let me add, though, that I will still be in double sort of figures on that investment if I were to convert it back into pounds, even if you were to take into account the currency sort of depreciation. So that, for me, kind of 10%, 12%, 15% in a year, I'll grab that every day. Yeah, so I'm feeling pretty good about that.
That is absolutely incredible, and you've heard it from the man himself. So, Jonathan, how can people find you? How can people contact you to talk about investment, talk about, just understanding the market, or how they can start wealth building better?
Okay. Well, the easiest way is to log on to the website, afrinomica.com, and to sign up to our newsletter, which mainly is focused on kind of sub-Saharan Africa, but we do actually look at investments across that kind of theatre, and more sort of broadly as well in the UK, the US, and the Eurozone in particular, or just email me. It's jonathan@afrinomica.com. Any questions? And I'm more than happy to get back to you and have a conversation. There's a lot for us to learn and to do. And by learning, often I learn as much from people that I interact with in terms of sort of questions. I learn as much from them, and sometimes even more, than the other way around, because everyone's kind of challenge or issues or knowledge is slightly kind of different. And I've actually got some great tips from some people that have got in touch with me via the website. So I'm always happy to engage with anyone who's got like a question. Funnily enough, just on that, I've been looking quite recently at the Egyptian sort of market. There's the key Egyptian market is called the EGX, a kind of 30. Never really thought of thinking about kind of following it until someone kind of mentioned it to me, and we had a conversation about it. And just to let you know, and you can check this if you want on the tradingeconomics.com, it's up 65% on the year. I would venture that anyone who thought they could get a 65% return on an investment would be absolutely kind of cock a hoop. So if I hadn't got that tip, or someone hadn't started speaking to me about the EGX, the sort of 30, it would have bypassed me sort of completely. So that's an example of stuff that you learn just from interacting with people that are sending you a kind of questions or kind of giving you a call or an email. So I'm more than willing to engage with any of the kind of listeners, but both on a kind of global issues, but also some kind of wealth and investment issues that are closer to home.
Well, you've heard the man himself. Reach out to him, touch base with him. You're also on Facebook and Twitter, if I'm not mistaken, as well. How can we connect with you on there?
The Twitter handle is at Afrinomica, and that's AFRINOMICA, Afrinomica. And the Facebook, just kind of search Afrinomica on the kind of Facebook, and you can kind of link up with us sort of there as well.
Okay. Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough for being on the show today. I will be calling you a little later and we'll continue this conversation, because I'm actually very interested and want to understand what I personally will do myself. So I cannot thank you enough for being on the show, and we're definitely looking at getting you back on.
Thanks very much, Lillian, and it's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Really has.
You're welcome. All right, everybody. So join us again, same time, same place next week. You know how we do it. And join me. If you miss it live, go onto our website, shineoutloud.tv, or even onto our page on YouTube, our YouTube page, and listen to the replay. It's been a great show, and we're talking about something that is actually vital to us. We need money for everything we're going to do. We can't live on love, unfortunately. It doesn't happen. We need money to put our kids through the right kind of school. We need money to grow and scale our businesses. We need to be generating income that outlives us. Not just an income, but we need to be generating wealth that is intergenerational and that can grow our community. This has been Lillian Abogo on the Shine Out Loud Show. Speak to you next Wednesday.
You've been listening to the Shine Out Loud Show. If you want to connect with us or let us know what you thought of today's show, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Shine Out Show.